Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of The Intersection, a series on the IQT Podcast where we discuss topics relating to the intersection of technology and national security. Today's guest is Dr. Michael Vickers, a former Special Forces officer and operations officer in the CIA's clandestine service. From 2011 to 2015, Dr. Vickers served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and from 2007 to 2011, he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low-Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities. He's also worked at IQT since 2015 and currently serves as a senior fellow here. In June, he published a new book titled By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence and Special Operations and Strategy, recounting his remarkable 40-plus year career. Today, we're going to discuss some of the major themes from the book and hear a firsthand account about his days as a Green Beret, to his vision for victory in Afghanistan, to his role in waging America's war with al-Qaeda, again, at the highest levels of government. So, Mike, welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Steve.
Yeah. So, a lot of different topics to get into here, but let me start with the first question. Why were you interested in writing this book?
Well, three reasons, really. One, I was fortunate enough over the course of my career to participate in three major events. In one case, kind of a world-changing event, our defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s that helped bring an end to the Cold War. And then later, when I was a senior defense and intelligence official, several of our campaigns against al-Qaeda worldwide, and then the operation that brought justice to Osama bin Laden. And a second reason, though, besides my duty to what I felt history, was duty to the American people. I spent my life keeping the nation's secrets. There's a lot for obvious reasons, we can't say about them. But where we can, I think there's a duty upon our top intelligence and defense leadership to explain why we did what we did to try to keep America safe, to make sure we sustain the support of the American people. And so that was the second objective. And then the third, and perhaps most important, was my duty to my fellow national security professionals, and particularly those who will take up the cudgel going forward. The world will be a much better place. It's getting more dangerous year by year. It'll be a much better place if we prevail in this new Cold War we find ourselves in with China and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And so I want to do what I can to pass on lessons I've learned and help those current and future professionals win.
Fantastic. So you spoke of your duty to the American people. Let's go back to the beginning. Why did you ultimately choose to enlist in the military and choose a life of service?
So I wanted to be a baseball or football player, and when I realized that wasn't happening...
That's a very noble goal, by the way.
Yes. I thought, what else am I going to do with my life? And a high school teacher my senior year slipped a copy of the New York Times in front of me in the school library and said, you might be interested in this. And it was a story about CIA secret paramilitary operations in Laos during the Vietnam War, supporting Hmong tribesmen. And I thought, leading secret armies, that sounds kind of cool. And, of course, I'd seen a lot of James Bond movies. And so I thought being a Green Beret, this was toward the end of the Vietnam War, would be a good way to start, with an ultimate aim of going into CIA. And then things took off after that.
That's great. So you joined, became a Green Beret. Tell me about that training process, because that's legendary.
Yeah. So, after 9/11, our Green Berets, had extensive training, but really went into combat, all our special operations forces and ground forces. And it was kind of nonstop for 10 years. In my day in the Cold War, coming out of Vietnam, we didn't have as much operations, so we had even more training. And so I trained on everything from, weapons, demolitions, guerrilla warfare, counterterrorism tactics, free fall parachuting, advanced mountain climbing, even trained with a backpack nuclear weapon to, in the event of war, to parachute into Eastern Europe with this thing. Seemed like a good idea when I was 23, maybe not so much later. But so lots of training, that and foreign languages. And, the training tests you physically and mentally, stresses you a lot, physically, makes you think on your feet, but ultimately rewarding.
Okay. And then what led you to move from there to CIA?
So it was my view. I'd gone from being a special forces soldier to an officer and commanded a counterterrorism intelligence unit. And I thought that, consistent with why I joined in the first place, I wanted to belong to organizations where individuals could really make a big difference in national security. I thought that it was more likely to come sooner in CIA. They were really the frontline instrument of the Cold War. We did a lot of things through covert action that we wouldn't do through overt military means, with given the risk of escalation to a broader war. And that, plus collecting intelligence, in some of the most difficult places, really seemed like a great challenge for me after I had done all the special forces stuff. So that's why I went to CIA.
So Russia invades Afghanistan. How did you get tapped to play the role that you did?
So I was really lucky. I'd come into CIA with a lot of special forces experience, which set me apart a little bit. And then early in my training, I had an extensive training program for about a year and a quarter. I had 2 special assignments. I was picked out of training to go for the invasion of Grenada, this tiny little Caribbean island we invaded in 1983 when we had medical students trapped there during a communist coup against other communist leaders. And then I had a special assignment dealing with counterterrorism after the Beirut bombings. Hezbollah terrorists had blown up our embassy and then Marine barracks in 1983. And those 2 things and my special forces experience came to the attention of the senior CIA leaders who were overseeing the Afghanistan covert action program. And then they picked me for that job. And I really called it the job of a lifetime. The budget had just been quadrupled by Congress. CIA didn't ask for it. Congress decided that we really needed to step up our effort. And so I thought, do I get to fight our main enemy rather than, his proxy somewhere with this dramatically increased budget, which already was the biggest covert action program in CIA and would get even bigger. And, that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah. So it's considered one of our great successes in our military and intelligence operational history. What worked? What was it about the operation that made it, that enabled its success?
So it was really about speed and scale, and then achieving escalation dominance. So, as I mentioned, the budget had been quadrupled, and a series of events, led to a presidential review of the program right as I was taking over. And that included reviewing our strategy and objectives. And up until that time, nobody thought we could win. And so our political objective was just to make the Soviet occupation as costly as possible. Okay. And then in March 1985, President Reagan, I helped work on this, but signed a classified national security decision directive that said our aim ought to be to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and had this phrase attached to it, by all means available, which I liked when I was a CIA officer in my 30s, and so it became the title of my book. And so we really ramped up then and enabled the Afghan resistance to conduct more operations, more complex operations. So everything increased within 12 months by an order of magnitude. The amount of weapons and ammunition we were putting in, the training we were given, and then it also increased in quality of things. We started introducing Western weapons, most famously the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, but a British anti-aircraft one as well, and some other Western weapons. Frequency hopping radios so that the Soviets couldn't direction find the Afghan resistance. And that really increased the cost of the Soviets. And Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power same time President Reagan signed this directive in March 1985, and he gave the Soviets a year to 18 months to win the war, which had been going on for 5 years at that point. And we essentially out escalated them. They were in worse shape 12 months later than they were when he gave that order. And so then Gorbachev decided to start withdrawing from Afghanistan in 1986 and was out completely by early 89.
So this was roughly 40 years ago. What lessons can we take? What's still true about, the environment you're operating in then that is true today as we think about the Russian conflict with Ukraine?
So, this was a covert action supporting an insurgency with an army that was occupying the whole country. Ukraine is a conventional war now in a more congested, confined battle space, in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. And so its characteristics are different, more artillery, but a lot of the principles are the same. The need to achieve a form of escalation dominance at the conventional level is still there. So, slowly we've gotten there in terms of the quantity and quality of weapons we've provided and some of the training, but it's taken some time. And so speed, this other factor I talked about besides scale and scope, we haven't moved necessarily as fast as we should. We've got a great coalition. We had that in the 1980s. We had China, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, the United Kingdom, and several others on our side. Today it's different players, mostly European, but that coalition capability is very important. So, and then the other thing that's very much in common is you need people willing to fight. And we had that in the Afghans in the 80s, and we have it with the Ukrainians right now who are fighting for their existence.
We absolutely have it with the Ukrainians. It's unbelievable what they're doing. So one of the criticisms of the current effort in Ukraine is that the coalition has trouble coming to agreement and making decisions. And thus, that's one of the reasons why we're perhaps moving slower than we otherwise should be. Yet you mentioned that in your experience in Afghanistan, you also had a similar coalition that you probably had to manage at some level. Expectations, motivations, all that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on the challenge? Because that's absolutely, as we think about potential next conflicts, right? In Asia, in some form or another, we will be operating once again as part of a coalition here. How do you think about operating and managing a coalition in one of these operations?
Yeah, well, as Winston Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting with a coalition is fighting without one, right. And it's part of the American way of war that we go with allies and partners, and it's an advantage of ours, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And so during the 80s, we had to get the Chinese to escalate, the Pakistanis, the frontline state, who was taking a lot of risks. The Saudis were matching us dollar for dollar. They had to agree to this tenfold increase in program funding within 12 months, et cetera. British to supply, advanced weapons that would be traced back to them. And then finally the U.S. to do it. So it's similar in that respect. You have some coalition partners in Ukraine who are very aggressive and bullish. I think they've generally been right. And others who, want this to end and, but don't want Ukraine to lose. And so you have challenges about the objectives, are we really in this to not have Ukraine lose? In other words, more or less defend what it has now or a little more, or to actually win and take back its territory and defeat the Russian forces. And so in some cases we've moved slower for coalition reasons, sometimes because of our own political decisions as well. So in that sense, it's a little different from the 80s. But I think we're getting there.
So this podcast sits at the intersection of national security and technology. We talked a lot about national security. Talk to me a little bit about technology. How has technology evolved from your experience in the 80s in Afghanistan to what you see from your various perspectives?
So it certainly played a role. It was recognized in the 80s that Western weapons were just superior. The Israelis clobbered Syrian air defenses in 82. We used some of these advanced technologies to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. And one of the reasons the Soviet military backed Gorbachev was they knew their economy needed to be rehabilitated or they would never compete over the long term. And that was a function of also of technologies the U.S. had deployed in Europe for deterrence purposes, precision strike weapons, sensors, a range of things that the Soviets knew they couldn't compete with and would obsolete their World War II style strategy. The pace of technological change is even greater today, far greater today, though, than it was then. So while it had, some impacts on war and some impacts on relative economic power during the Cold War, it really is the central competition, in my view, right now between us and China going forward, economic and technological, how technological turns into both economic power and national security power. But at its core, it's really these revolutions in technology. Three big ones, as artificial intelligence and autonomy, quantum computing and other quantum technologies, and synthetic biology, but a lot of others too, from batteries to nuclear fusion that really are going to transform the world over the next 20 years. And the winner of that is likely going to be the winner.
So you get that, which is unusual for someone who grew up in the military, and was not a technologist at first. Do you think that the defense and intelligence leadership here in the United States understands the importance of technology that you just articulated?
Yeah, technological advantage has become, since the end of World War II, really, key to the American way of war. Sometimes it confers big advantages, other times not so much, depending on the role. But I think at the grand strategy level, they increasingly realize this, whether it translates all into the military systems or whether we do enough with national R&D, to translate this into policy. We spend a quarter of our GDP as a percentage of GDP today on national R&D that we did in the 50s and 60s when we had the great boom, fueled by the space race and other things. But I think there is growing awareness that this is really what matters, and then we'll see how well we can implement it.
And then, what are you seeing in terms of the role of commercial technology developed by non-traditional vendors for the defense and intelligence world playing in Ukraine, and how does that translate going forward if there are conflicts in Asia and other places like that?
Yeah, so these big transformative technologies are really outside the traditional defense or national security industrial base. And, and they may have different impacts on national security, but if they produce great wealth, that's an indirect but very important effect on national security. You can just buy more of whatever you want to buy. And, all of them have national security implications to a greater or lesser extent. Let me just pause. Go ahead.
That's a great point. So if commercial technology and technology in general is going to play a greater and greater role, how do we educate either folks in Congress or folks in the Pentagon who didn't grow up in a technology-oriented environment, understanding the potentials and strategies that might be involved in some of these technologies?
Yeah, so the broader problem, I think, is technological literacy in general. And then the challenge more is that a lot of these technologies, really the critical ones, are outside the traditional defense sphere. So even if you knew submarine warfare technologies, things that go into that, or stealth technologies for aircraft, or maybe even things that start to move over to the commercial sector, networking technologies, there's still a big chunk that's outside that traditional realm. But more broadly, it's making sure we have more technical talent that in very influential policy positions in the White House and in our top agencies. Our two new warfighting domains, space and cyber, are fundamentally technological. And that's just one aspect of the problem. So, how we do that, we did a good job of that in the 50s, partly as a result because we had so many scientists from MIT and elsewhere who helped us win World War II. They rallied like other Americans to the cause. That's more of a challenge today. There's a bigger gulf between the private sector, the high-tech sector, and the national security establishment. And it's something our political leadership really has to work on.
So one of the other areas that you spent sort of your career really driving and enhancing is the alignment between the military and the intelligence communities. How do you think we're doing with regard to that alignment? In this stage, and where can we go from here?
Yeah, so there's a couple aspects to that. One, intelligence or first line of defense, and defense has the lion's share of the intelligence community and the intelligence budget. There's a few that lie outside it, CIA being the biggest one, but FBI and then smaller components that are inside other cabinet departments. But, defense has NSA, NRO, DIA, NGA, and then the service and combatant command intelligence organizations. And so making sure that our intelligence community, of which defense is a big part, can support our national leadership, but also our warfighting needs, is a challenge for the top leadership, something I wrestled with a lot with USD when I was Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence with the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper at the time. And then operationally, CIA and DOD, or our armed forces, are really our two main operational arms to do things. And so, and they're often at the leading edge of technology. And so cooperation in those spheres, operationally, what's the right mix of that, or who should take the lead on something depending on policy preferences. So for instance, we did the bin Laden raid with military forces under CIA authorities. It's just one example of the marriage, if you will. But it's also an acquisition and technology development. We have common needs a lot of times. So it's something I worked on pretty hard, given that I had, history in both camps. And it's very important to the successful functioning of our national security establishment.
So you've gone from being sort of the young leader to the old wise veteran here. What advice or perspective?
Emphasis on old. Yeah.
What advice or perspective do you have for the young up and coming next generation of leaders with regard to the intersection of technology and national security?
Yeah. So as I said, I think it's really the central competition. And so whatever field you're in national security, you have to be cognizant of these things, whether it's little drone, if you're an infantryman that are flying over your positions all the time now, as we see in Ukraine, and that can be lethal to you, to how to exploit various technologies. And as you move up the ranks and broaden, things like space and cyber and enabled by AI and maybe quantum, just are fundamentally technologically and cutting edge technology. So, it would be critical to anyone's future. And then I would say too that, more broadly, find something that you're passionate about and you can make a difference. Too many people, even at the top levels of government, manage rather than transform when it's necessary or lead. And, if you're given responsibility as you move up in your careers, make a difference. That doesn't mean do anything reckless, but, that's what our great entrepreneurs do. That's what, visionary business leaders do it, and we need it in national security just as much.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us here today. I think your observations and stories have been fascinating. We appreciate everyone tuning in today's episode of The Intersection. Please make sure you subscribe to the IQT Podcast so you don't miss out on future content, and leave us a review or comment to let us know what you think or what content you'd be interested to see us cover in a future podcast. I also encourage you to check out IQT's website, www.iqt.org, to explore more content about the cutting-edge technology to support and deliver insights and capabilities essential for national security mission impact. Mike, thank you very much. And thank you to our listeners for joining us at The Intersection today.
My pleasure.